channel. My name is Jenny, and today for Vlogmas I am going to be wrapping up my November reading and letting you know what I read. I ended up reading or listening to 6 books this month, and I'm going to start with the audiobooks. The first audiobook I did was for Nonfiction November, and it was Fly Girls by Keith O'Brien. I really enjoyed this nonfiction read. It followed the careers of 5 different important women in aviation. Of course, the name we always know is Amelia Earhart, so it does talk about Amelia Earhart, but it also talks about a lot of other women, Ruth Nichols, Ruth Lehman, I think her name was. There's a lot of other women that were really influential in the development of aviation in the United States. And Keith O'Brien did a great job of going through them and making them come to life. And I was riveted at different points in this story because there were women that lost their lives. There were women that had horrible crashes which broke bones and all over their body, and they had to recover for months at a time, but they were still so dedicated to aviation that they continued on. And it was really interesting to contrast the lives of the women who continued and lived and did not disappear the way Amelia Earhart did, and did not have the kind of media machine, because even though it was the 1930s, Amelia Earhart had very powerful husband, very powerful team that created her persona and that helped her to be the most famous woman aviator. But a lot of other women worked really hard in this industry to establish themselves, and they broke records and they won competitions, and it was a really great book. I would highly recommend it. The listening experience was not my favorite because I didn't really like the narrator of this story. She had a very robotic sounding voice. I kept going because I liked the subject matter quite a bit, and I was able to just let the robotic voice flow off. And I did find that her voice became less robotic as the book progressed. So yeah, I would say read it in hard copy, listen to it if you don't mind her voice, and really great read. Really inspiring to hear the stories of these women, and also just as exciting as any adventure novel you could ever read, because these women just did amazing feats. And he also goes into a lot of the men as well, because I think in some cases he gave a bit too much context to the men, but he was trying to establish where they fit in the history of aviation and how they influenced the experiences of the women. I mean, some of this book is so frustrating because these men were horrendous to the women a lot of the time. They just put restrictions on their ability to fly that were so unreasonable, but these women persevered, and it's a great story of perseverance. So my second audiobook of the month was Medicine Walk by Richard Wagamese. Richard Wagamese is a Indigenous author of Canada, and he wrote Indian Horse, which is probably his most famous, as far as I know, book. And I decided to listen to Medicine Walk, and it was a really wonderful story. It is the story of an estranged father and son, and how they reunite, how they make peace with each other. It's a story of redemption. It's a story of failure. The basic premise is that the father is dying, and he asks his son to take him out into the wilds where he can perish there. And the son agrees to do this, and they take a difficult journey because there's so much pain between them. And the thing that I really loved about this story was that in a previous book that I read that involved a father and son, there was absolutely no mention of the mother. It was like the boy was just born miraculously and fell from the sky, left by a stork, and there was no mother who existed. It was just about the father and the son. In this book, the mother is a silent character that continues through the whole story, and you feel her absence, and you feel the desire of the young man to know about his mother. And so that I felt was very well done. And I did really enjoy the story. I will definitely read more of Richard Wagamese's work, and the narrator was also really wonderful. So I would recommend Medicine Walk by Richard Wagamese. Okay, so I'll go through my other two nonfiction November reads. Girls to the Front by Sara Marcus was my carryover from September. So I started in September, finished in November, and I would say I enjoyed this story. I would say if you are interested in this specific period, then give this a try. If you're not, I'm not sure how well this book would carry you through. Unlike Fly Girls, it doesn't have a lot of action-packed adventure stories. This is very much about women trying to find their way in a feminist movement in a very specific time, the early 1990s. It's not very there's not a lot of plot here. You're just learning a lot about people's movements through the movement itself. So where they were living, what they were doing, how they were bringing people into the movement, how the movement was perceived in the larger community and through the media and all these things. So Fly Girls also does that, but this book is just a different period in time and women facing different types of struggles. So it was kind of interesting to contrast the two of them in that way. But, you know, the writing was fine. It was very informational, but there was nothing very inspiring about this book. And I think because the writer experienced the movement herself and was in it, she perhaps focused on details that someone who wasn't in the movement wouldn't necessarily find as interesting. So yeah, overall, if you're interested in this period in music, and so in punk rock music in the early 1990s and feminism, then I would say go for it. If you're not, then you may not want to try this one out. Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Talaga was my third read for nonfiction November. And this book is so complex and so important that I will be doing a specific review for this book by itself. So I won't say too much about it here, just to keep this video not too long. But please look out for the review of this later on this month. I will post it also as part of Vlogmas. And I would just say that if you are interested in learning about what colonialism does to Indigenous people and how it affects generation after generation, then this is the book that you should read to understand that. It was very well done, and yeah, like I said, look out for a review of this in the coming days. I read a poetry collection in November, and that is Taking the Names Down from the Hill by Philip Kevin Paul. This is a prize-winning booklet of poems, and I highly enjoyed these. Philip Kevin Paul is a Indigenous poet. He grew up on Vancouver Island, I believe, in the Saanich area of British Columbia. These poems are quite beautiful. There are a lot of poems that are dedicated to family members in here. There are a lot of poems about nature, birds, and he has a wonderful style, a wonderful way of putting words together. So they are deeply moving, but deeply personal as well. But you still feel pulled into them, even though they are personal poems. So a great collection. The final book that I finished in November was Surfacing by Margaret Atwood. This is part of my 1970s project, in which I'm reading a book from each year of the decade of the 1970s to start. This book is from 1972. I have a lot of feelings about this book. I'm not really sure how to articulate it yet, and it's been a few days and I still can't really articulate it properly, but this story is in some ways one of the most accessible novels I've read of Atwood's, and I've read quite a few. I think I've read 8 or 9 thus far. So for the first half of the book, it's very accessible. You're in the mind of our protagonist. We don't know her name. And she is going to a very remote island on a lake in northern Quebec where she grew up and where her family, her parents, have lived on once they left home. Her father has gone missing, and so they're going to try to figure out where he is and what happened to him. And they is herself, her boyfriend, and another couple. So with that basic plot, I don't want to tell you too much more about what happens and how it happens, because it's very surprising and kind of jarring. And so the second half of the book removed me a little bit from the accessibility that I felt that this had. And it also made me feel slightly, not uncomfortable, but just confused. I felt a bit confused. But there are some really amazing themes in here. And I feel like in a lot of ways, it's a companion to Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion. So the themes of women's emancipation in here are very interesting to think about. And also the blurb on the flap of this talks about how it's a monumental book of nature writing, so along the lines of Joseph Conrad and James Dickey, who I have not read, but I believe for Joseph Conrad they're comparing it to Heart of Darkness. And I understand why they are. This is definitely a difficult psychological read, because you are in the head of this character and you watch her break, sorry about the birds, and you go down somewhere with her. So I feel very all over the place about this. I loved it. I was frustrated by it. I feel like it's very important. There's so many important things that are talked about in here, but whether or not it's conveyed in a way that it is accessible enough to people, that is what I wonder. And I think I struggle with that every time I read an Atwood. I'm drawn to her books, I'm drawn to her voice, and yet it's very rare that I'll read one and love it instantly. It's just not my experience with her. So yeah, I guess that's why she is quite a polarizing author. And yeah, so I will talk about all of the books in my 1970s project again. Once I've finished the first 10, I'm going to do a little wrap up of them, but that's probably the most in-depth that I will get of that. And I'd also like to say that I love this photograph of her on the back. It's so lovely. If you like nature writing, you'll probably like this book as well, because it talks about a certain part of the world that is not talked about that much, northern Quebec on a lake. And I do think there's a few things in it that are slightly dated, so you gotta kind of take those with a grain of salt to think about the way certain Canadians, young, early to mid-20s Canadians, were thinking about politics in the early 70s. So just keep that in mind as well if you decide to read it. So those were the books that I read in November. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will be back again tomorrow, and I will have another video for you.